Track 1. The Woman in White. Track 1.
The First Epoch. The story begun by Walter Hartright, of Clement's Inn, teacher of drawing. This is the story of what a woman's patience can endure, and what a man's resolution can achieve. If the machinery of the law could be depended on to fathom every case of suspicion, and to conduct every process of inquiry with moderate assistance only from the lubricating influences of oil of gold, the events which fill these pages might have claimed their share of the public attention in a court of justice. But the law is still, in certain inevitable cases, the pre-engaged servant of the long purse, and the story is left to be told, for the first time in this place. As the judge might once have heard it, so the reader shall hear it now. No circumstance of importance from the beginning to the end of the disclosure shall be related on hearsay evidence. When the writer of these introductory lines, Walter Hartright by name, happens to be more closely connected than others with the incidents to be recorded, he will describe them in his own person. When his experience fails, he will retire from the position of narrator, and his task will be continued from the point at which he has left it off, by other persons who can speak to the circumstances under notice from their own knowledge, just as clearly and positively as he has spoken before them. Thus the story here presented will be told by more than one pen, as the story of an offence against the laws is told in court by more than one witness, with the same object in both cases, to present the truth always in its most direct and most intelligible aspect, and to trace the course of one complete series of events, by making the persons who have been most closely connected with them at each successive stage relate their own experience word for word. Let Walter Hartright, teacher of drawing, aged 28 years, be heard first. It was the last day of July. The long, hot summer was drawing to a close, and we, the weary pilgrims of the London pavement, were beginning to think of the cloud shadows on the cornfields and the autumn breezes on the seashore. For my own poor part, the fading summer left me out of health, out of spirits, and, if the truth must be told, out of money as well. During the past year I had not managed my professional resources as carefully as usual, and my extravagance now limited me to the prospect of spending the autumn economically, between my mother's cottage at Hampstead and my own chambers in town. The evening, I remember, was still and cloudy. The London air was at its heaviest. The distant hum of the street traffic was at its faintest. The small pulse of life within me, and the great heart of the city around me, seemed to be sinking in unison, languidly and more languidly, with the sinking sun. I roused myself from the book which I was dreaming over rather than reading, and left my chambers to meet the cool night air in the suburbs. It was one of the 2 evenings in every week which I was accustomed to spend with my mother and my sister. So I turned my steps northward in the direction of Hampstead. Events which I have yet to relate make it necessary to mention in this place that my father had been dead for some years at the period of which I am now writing, and that my sister Sarah and I were the sole survivors of a family of 5 children. My father was a drawing master before me. His exertions had made him highly successful in his profession, and his affectionate anxiety to provide for the future of those who were dependent on his labours had impelled him from the time of his marriage to devote to the ensuring of his life a much larger portion of his income than most men consider it necessary to set aside for that purpose. Thanks to his admirable prudence and self-denial, my mother and sister were left after his death as independent of the world as they had been during his lifetime. I succeeded to his connection, and had every reason to feel grateful for the prospect that awaited me at my starting in life. The quiet twilight was still trembling on the topmost ridges of the heath, and the view of London below me had sunk into a black gulf in the shadow of the cloudy night, when I stood before the gate of my mother's cottage. I had hardly rung the bell before the house door was opened violently. My worthy Italian friend, Professor Pesca, appeared in the servant's place, and darted out joyously to receive me, with a shrill foreign parody of an English cheer. On his own account, and I must be allowed to add on mine also, the Professor merits the honour of a formal introduction. Accident has made him the starting point of the strange family story which it is the purpose of these pages to unfold. I had first become acquainted with my Italian friend by meeting him at certain great houses where he taught his own language and I taught drawing. All I then knew of the history of his life was he had once held a position in the University of Padua, that he had left Italy for political reasons, the nature of which he uniformly declined to mention to anyone, and that he had been for many years respectably established in London as a teacher of languages. Without being actually a dwarf, for he was perfectly well proportioned from head to foot, Peshka was, I think, the smallest human being I ever saw out of a show-room. Remarkable anywhere by his personal appearance, he was still further distinguished among the rank and file of mankind by the harmless eccentricity of his character. The ruling idea of his life appeared to be that he was bound to show his gratitude to the country which had afforded him an asylum and a means of subsistence by doing his utmost to turn himself into an Englishman. Not content with paying the nation in general the compliment of invariably carrying an umbrella and invariably wearing gaiters and a white hat, the Professor further aspired to become an Englishman in his habits and amusements, as well as in his personal appearance. Finding us distinguished as a nation by our love of athletic exercises, the little man, in the innocence of his heart, devoted himself impromptu to all our English sports and pastimes whenever he had the opportunity of joining them, firmly persuaded that he could adopt our national amusements of the field by an effort of will, precisely as he had adopted our national gaiters and our national white hat. I had seen him risk his limbs blindly at a fox hunt and in a cricket field, and soon afterwards I saw him risk his life just as blindly in the sea at Brighton. We had met there accidentally and were bathing together. If we had been engaged in any exercise particular to my own nation, I should, of course, have looked after Peshka carefully. But as foreigners are generally quite as well able to take care of themselves in the water as Englishmen, it never occurred to me that the art of swimming might merely add one more to the list of manly exercises which the Professor believed that he could learn impromptu. Soon after we had both struck out from the shore, I stopped, finding my friend did not gain on me, and turned around to look for him. To my horror and amazement, I saw nothing between me and the beach but two little white arms which struggled for an instant above the surface of the water, and then disappeared from view. When I dived for him, the poor little man was lying quietly coiled up at the bottom in a hollow of shingle, looking by many degrees smaller than I'd ever seen him look before. During the few minutes that elapsed while I was taking him in, the air revived him, and he ascended the steps of the machine with my assistance. With the partial recovery of his animation came the return of his wonderful delusion on the subject of swimming. As soon as his chattering teeth would let him speak, he smiled vacantly and said he thought it must have been the cramp. When he thoroughly recovered himself and had joined me on the beach, his warm southern nature broke through all artificial English restraints in a moment. He overwhelmed me with the wildest expressions of affection, exclaimed passionately in his exaggerated Italian way that he would hold his life henceforth at my disposal, and declared that he should never be happy again until he had found an opportunity of proving his gratitude by rendering me some service which I might remember on my side to the end of my days. I did my best to stop the torrent of his tears and protestations by persisting in treating the whole adventure as a good subject for a joke, and succeeded at last, as I imagined, in lessening Peshka's overwhelming sense of obligation to me. Little did I think then, little did I think afterwards, when our pleasant holiday had drawn to an end, that the opportunity of serving me for which my grateful companion so ardently longed was soon to come, that he was eagerly to seize it on an instant, and that by doing so he was to turn the whole current of my existence into a new channel, and to alter me to myself almost past recognition. Yet so it was, for if I had not dived for Professor Peshka when he lay under the water on his shingle bed, I should in all human probability never have been connected with the story which these pages will relate. I should never, perhaps, have heard even the name of the woman who has lived in all my thoughts, who has possessed herself of all my energies, who has become the one guiding influence that now directs the purpose of my life. Peshka's face and manner on the evening when we confronted each other at my mother's gate were more than sufficient to inform me that something extraordinary had happened. It was quite useless, however, to ask him for an immediate explanation. I could only conjecture, while he was dragging me in by both hands, that, knowing my habits, he'd come to the cottage to make sure of meeting me that night, and that he had some news to tell me of an unusually agreeable kind. We both bounced into the parlour in a highly abrupt and undignified manner. My mother sat by the open window, laughing and fanning herself. Pesca was one of her especial favourites, and his wildest eccentricities were always pardonable in her eyes. Poor dear soul! From the first moment when she found out that the little professor was deeply and gratefully attached to her son, she opened her heart to him unreservedly, and took all his puzzling foreign peculiarities for granted, without so much as attempting to understand any one of them. My sister Sarah, with all the advantages of youth, was, strangely enough, less pliable. She did full justice to Pesca's excellent qualities of heart, but she could not accept him implicitly as my mother accepted him for my sake. Her insular notions of propriety rose in perpetual revolt against Pesca's constitutional contempt for appearances, and she was always more or less undisguisedly astonished at her mother's familiarity with the eccentric little foreigner. I have observed, not only in my sister's case, but in the instances of others, that we of the young generation are nothing like so hearty and so impulsive as some of our elders. I consistently see old people flushed and excited by the prospect of some anticipated pleasure which altogether fails to ruffle the tranquillity of their serene grandchildren. Are we, I wonder, quite such genuine boys and girls now as our seniors were in their time? Has the great advance in education taken rather too long a stride, and are we in these modern days just the least trifle in the world too well brought up? Without attempting to answer these questions decisively, I may at least record that I never saw my mother and my sister together in Pesca's society without finding my mother much the younger woman of the two. On this occasion, for example, while the old lady was laughing heartily over the boyish manner in which we had tumbled into the parlour, Sarah was perturbedly picking up the broken pieces of a teacup, which the professor had knocked off the table in his precipitate advance to meet me at the door. "I don't know what would have happened, Walter," said my mother, "if you delayed much longer. Pesca had been half mad with impatience, and I have been half mad with curiosity. The professor has brought some wonderful news with him, in which he says you are concerned, and he has cruelly refused to give us the smallest hint of it till his friend Walter appeared." "Very provoking. It spoils the set," murmured Sarah to herself, mournfully absorbed over the ruins of the broken cup. While these words were being spoken, Pesca, happily and fussily unconscious of the irreparable wrong which the crockery had suffered at his hands, was dragging a large arm-chair to the opposite end of the room, so as to command us all three, in the character of a public speaker addressing an audience. Having turned the chair with its back towards us, he jumped into it on his knees, and excitedly addressed his small congregation of three from an impromptu pulpit. "Now, my good dears," began Pesca, who always said good dears when he meant worthy friends, "listen to me. The time has come. I recite my good news. I speak at last." "Hear, hear," said my mother, humouring the joke. "The next thing he'll break, mamma," whispered Sarah, "will be the back of the best arm-chair. I go back into my life, and I address myself to the noblest of created beings," continued Pesca, vehemently apostrophizing my unworthy self over the top rail of the chair, "who found me dead at the bottom of the sea, through cramp, and who pulled me to the top. And what did I say when I got into my own life and my own clothes again?" "Much more than was at all necessary," I answered as doggedly as possible, for the least encouragement in connection with this subject invariably let loose the professor's emotions in a flood of tears. "I said," persisted the Pesca, "that my life belonged to my dear friend Walter for the rest of my days, and so it does. I said that I should never be happy again until I found the opportunity for doing a good something for Walter, and I have never been contented with myself until this most blessed day." "Now," cried the enthusiastic little man at the top of his voice, The overflowing happiness bursts out of me at every pore of my skin like perspiration. For on my faith, my soul, and my honour, the something is done at last, and the only word to say now is right, all right. It may be necessary to explain here that Pesca prided himself on being a perfect Englishman in his language, as well as in his dress, manners, and amusements. Having picked up a few of our most familiar colloquial expressions, he scattered them about over his conversation whenever they happened to occur to him, turning them in his high relish for their sound and his general ignorance of their sense into compound words and repetitions of his own, and always running them into each other as if they consisted of one long syllable. "Among the fine London houses where I teach the language of my native country," said the Professor, rushing into his long-deferred explanation without another word of preface, "there is one, mighty fine, in the big place called Portland. You all know where that is. Yes, of course. My fine house, my good dears, has got inside it a fine family. A mamma, fair and fat. 3 young misses, fair and fat. 2 young misters, fair and fat. And a papa, the fairest and the fattest of all, who is a mighty merchant, up to his eyes in gold. A fine man once, but seeing that he has got a naked head and 2 chins, fine no longer at the present time. Now, mind, I teach the sublime Dante to the young misses. And, my soul, bless my soul, it is not in human language to say how the sublime Dante puzzles the pretty heads of all 3. No matter, all in good time. And the more lessons the better for me. Now mind, imagine yourselves that I am teaching the young misses to-day as usual. We are all 4 of us down together in the hell of Dante at the 7th circle. But no matter for what, all the circles are alike to the 3 young misses, fair and fat. At the 7th circle, nevertheless, my pupils are sticking fast, and I, to set them going again, recite, explain, and blow myself up red-hot with useless enthusiasm, when a creak of boots in the passage outside, and in comes the golden papa, the mighty merchant, with the naked head and the 2 chins. Ha, my good dears, I am closer than you think, for to the business now. Have you been patient so far, or have you said to yourselves, deuce what the deuce, Pesca is long-winded to-night? We declared that we were deeply interested. The Professor went on. In his hand the golden papa has a letter, and after he's made his excuse for disturbing us in our infernal region with the common mortal business of the house, he addresses himself to the 3 young misses, and begins, as you English begin everything in this blessed world that you have to say, with a great O. "Oh, my dears," says the mighty merchant, "I have got here a letter from my friend Mr. The name slipped out of my mind, but no matter. We shall come back to that. Yes, all right. So the papa says, I have got a letter from my friend the Mr., and he wants a recommend from me of a drawing master to go down to his house in the country. My soul, bless my soul! When I heard the golden papa say those words, if I had been big enough to reach up to him, I should have put my arms round his neck and pressed him to my bosom in a long and grateful hug. As it was, I only bounced upon my chair. My seat was on thorns, and my soul was on fire to speak, but I held my tongue and let papa go on. "Perhaps you know," says this good man of money, twiddling his friend's letter this way and that, in his golden fingers and thumbs, "perhaps you know, my dears, of a drawing master that I can recommend." The 3 young misses all look at each other, and then say, with the indispensable great O to begin, "Oh, dear no, papa. But here is Mr. Pesca." At the mention of myself, I can hold no longer. The thought of you, my good dears, mounts like blood to my head. I start from my seat as if a spike had grown up from the ground through the bottom of my chair. I address myself to the mighty merchant, and I say, English phrase, "Dear sir, I have the man, the first and foremost drawing master of the world. Recommend him by the post to-night, and send him off bag and baggage." English phrase again. Ha! "Send him off bag and baggage by the train tomorrow." Stop, says papa. "Is he a foreigner or an Englishman?" "Englishman to the bone of his back," I answer. "Respectable?" says papa. "Sir," I say, for this last question of his outrages me, and I have done being familiar with him. Sir, the immortal fire of genius burns in this Englishman's bosom, and what is more, his father had it before him. Never mind, says the golden barbarian of a papa. Never mind about his genius, Mr. Pesca. We don't want genius in this country unless it's accompanied by respectability. And then we are very glad to have it, very glad indeed. Can your friend produce testimonials? Letters that speak to his character? I wave my hand negligently. Letters, I say. Ha! My soul, bless my soul, I should think so indeed. Volumes of letters and portfolios of testimonials, if you like. 1 or 2 will do, says this man of phlegm and money. Let him send them to me with his name and address. And stop, Mr. Pesca, before you go to your friend, you had better take a note. Banknote? I say indignantly. No banknote, if you please, till my brave Englishman has earned it first. Banknote? Says Papa in great surprise. Who talked of banknote? I mean a note of the terms, a memorandum of what he is expected to do. Go on with your lesson, Mr. Pesca, and I will give you the necessary extract from my friend's letter. Down sits the man of merchandise and money to his pen, ink, and paper, and down I go once again into the hell of Dante, with the 3 young misses after me. In 10 minutes' time the note is written. The boots of Papa are creaking themselves away in the passage outside. From that moment, on my faith and soul and honour, I know nothing more. The glorious thought that I have caught my opportunity at last, and that my grateful service for my dearest friend in the world is as good as done already, flies up into my head and makes me drunk. How I pull my young missus and myself out of the infernal region again, and how my other business is done afterwards, how my little bit of dinner slides itself down my throat, I know no more than a man in the moon. Enough for me that here I am, with the mighty merchant's note in my hand, as large as life, as hot as fire, and as happy as a king. Ha, ha, ha! Right, all right! Here the Professor waved the memorandum of terms above his head, and ended his long and voluble narrative with his shrill Italian parody of an English cheer. My mother rose the moment he had done, with flushed cheeks and brightened eyes. She caught the little man warmly by both hands. "My dear, good Pesca," she said, "I never doubted your true affection for Walter, but I am more than ever persuaded of it now." "I am sure we are very much obliged to Professor Pesca for Walter's sake," added Sarah. She half rose while she spoke, as if to approach the arm-chair in her turn, but observing that Pesca was rapturously kissing my mother's hands, looked serious and resumed her seat. "If the familiar little man treats my mother that way, how will he treat me?" Faces sometimes tell truth, and that was unquestionably the thought in Sarah's mind as she sat down again. Although I myself was gratefully sensible of the kindness of Pesca's motives, my spirits were hardly so much elevated as they ought to have been by the prospect of future employment now placed before me. When the Professor had quite done with my mother's hand, and when I had warmly thanked him for his interference on my behalf, I asked to be allowed to look at the note of terms which his respectable patron had drawn up for my inspection. Pesca handed me the paper with a triumphant flourish of the hand. "Read," said the little man majestically. "I promise you, my friend, the writing of the Golden Papa speaks with a tongue of trumpets for itself." The note was plain, straightforward, and comprehensive, at any rate. It informed me, first, that Frederick Fairlie, Esquire, of Limmeridge House, Cumberland, wanted to engage the services of a thoroughly competent drawing-master for a period of 4 months certain. Second, that the duties which the master was expected to perform would be of a twofold kind. He was to superintend the instruction of 2 young ladies in the art of painting in water-colours, and he was to devote his leisure time afterwards to the business of repairing and mounting a valuable collection of drawings which had suffered to fall into a condition of total neglect. Thirdly, that the terms offered to the person who should undertake and properly perform these duties were 4 guineas a week, and that he was to reside at Limmeridge House, and that he was to be treated there on the footing of a gentleman. Fourthly, and lastly, that no person need think of applying for this situation unless he could furnish the most unexceptionable references to character and abilities. The references were to be sent to Mr. Fairlie's friend in London, who was empowered to conclude all necessary arrangements. These instructions were followed by the name and address of Pesca's employer in Portland Place, and there the note or memorandum ended. The prospect which this offer of an engagement held out was certainly an attractive one. The employment was likely to be both easy and agreeable. It was proposed to me at the autumn time of the year, when I was least occupied, and the terms, judging by my personal experience in my profession, were surprisingly liberal. I knew this. I knew that I ought to consider myself very fortunate if I succeeded in securing the offered employment, and yet no sooner had I read the memorandum than I felt an inexplicable unwillingness within me to stir in the matter. I had never in the whole of my previous experience found my duty and my inclination so painfully and so unaccountably at variance as I found them now. "Oh, Walter, your father never had such a chance as this," said my mother, when she had read the note of terms and handed it back to me. "Such distinguished people to know," remarked Sarah, straightening herself in the chair, "and on such gratifying terms of equality, too." Yes, the terms in every sense are tempting enough," I replied impatiently. "But before I send my testimonials, I should like a little time to consider—" "Consider!" exclaimed my mother. "Why, Walter, what is the matter with you?" "Consider!" echoed my sister. "What a very extraordinary thing to say under the circumstances." "Consider!" chimed in the Professor. "What is there to consider about? Answer me this. Have you not been complaining of your health? And have you not been longing for what you call a smack of the country breeze? Well, there in your hand is the paper that offers you perpetual choking mouthfuls of country breeze for 4 months' time. Is it not so? Ha! Again you want money. Well, is 4 golden guineas a week nothing? My soul bless my soul! Only give it to me, and my boots shall creak like the golden papas with a sense of overpowering richness of the man who walks in them. 4 guineas a week! And more than that, the charming society of 2 young misses, and more than that, your bed, your breakfast, your dinner, and your gorging English teas and lunches, and drinks of foaming beer, and all for nothing. Why, Walter, my dear good friend, deuce what the deuce! For the first time in my life I have not eyes enough in my head to look and wonder at you." Neither my mother's evident astonishment at my behaviour, nor Pesca's fervid enumeration of the advantages offered to me by the new employment, had any effect in shaking my unreasonable disinclination to go to Limmeridge House. After starting all the petty objections that I could think of to going to Cumberland, and after hearing them answered, one after another, to my own complete discomfiture, I tried to set up a last obstacle by asking what was to become of my pupils in London while I was teaching Mr. Fairlie's young ladies to sketch from nature. The obvious answer to this was that the greater part of them would be away on their autumn travels, and that the few who remained at home might be confided to the care of one of my brother drawing-masters, whose pupils I had once taken off his hands under similar circumstances. My sister reminded me that this gentleman had expressly placed his services at my disposal during the present season, in case I wished to leave town. My mother seriously appealed to me not to let an idle caprice stand in the way of my own interests and my own health, and Pesca piteously entreated that I would not wound him to the heart by rejecting the first grateful offer of service that he had been able to make to the friend who had saved his life. The evident sincerity and affection which inspired these remonstrances would have influenced any man with an atom of good feeling in his composition, though I could not conquer my own unaccountable perversity. I had at least virtue enough to be heartily ashamed of it, and to end the discussion pleasantly by giving way, and promising to do all that was wanted of me. The rest of the evening passed merrily enough in humorous anticipations of my coming life with the 2 young ladies in Cumberland. Pesca, inspired by our national grog, which appeared to get into his head in the most marvellous manner, 5 minutes after it had gone down his throat, asserted his claims to be considered a complete Englishman, by making a series of speeches in rapid succession, proposing my mother's health, my sister's health, my health, and the healths in the mass of Mr. Fairlie and the two young misses, pathetically returning thanks himself immediately afterwards for the whole party. "A secret, Walter," said my little friend confidentially, as we walked home together. "I am flushed by the recollection of my own eloquence. My soul bursts itself with ambition. One of these days I go into your noble Parliament. It is the dream of my whole life to be Honourable Pesca MP." The next morning I sent my testimonials to the Professor's employer in Portland Place. 3 days passed, and I concluded with secret satisfaction that my papers had not been found sufficiently explicit. On the 4th day, however, an answer came. It announced that Mr. Fairlie had accepted my services and requested me to start for Cumberland immediately. All the necessary instructions for my journey were carefully and clearly added in a postscript. I made my arrangements, unwillingly enough, for leaving London early the next day. Towards evening Pesca looked in, on his way to a dinner party, to bid me good-bye. "I shall dry my tears in your absence," said the Professor gaily, "with this glorious thought. It is my auspicious hand that has given the first push to your fortune in the world. Go, my friend. When your sun shines in Cumberland, English proverb, in the name of heaven make your hay. Marry one of the young misses. Become Honourable Hartright MP. And when you are at the top of the ladder, remember that Pesca at the bottom has done it all." I tried to laugh with my little friend over his parting jest, but my spirits were not to be commanded. Something jarred in me almost painfully while he was speaking his light farewell words. When I was left alone again, nothing remained to be done but to walk to the Hampstead cottage and bid my mother and Sarah good-bye. 4. The heat had been painfully oppressive all day, and it was now a close and sultry night. My mother and sister had spoken so many last words, and had begged me to wait another 5 minutes so many times, that it was nearly midnight when the servant locked the garden gate behind me. I walked forward a few paces on the shortest way back to London, then stopped and hesitated. The moon was full and broad in the dark blue starless sky, and the broken ground of the heath looked wild enough in the mysterious light to be hundreds of miles away from the great city that lay beneath it. The idea of descending any sooner than I could help into the heat and gloom of London repelled me. The prospect of going to bed in my airless chambers, and the prospect of gradual suffocation, seemed in my present restless state of mind and body to be one and the same thing. I determined to stroll home in the purer air by the most roundabout way I could take, to follow the white winding paths across the lonely heath, and to approach London through its most open suburb, by striking into Finchley Road, and so getting back in the cool of the new morning to the western side of Regent's Park. I wound my way down slowly over the heath, enjoying the divine stillness of the scene, and admiring the soft alternations of light and shade as they followed each other over the broken ground on every side of me. So long as I was proceeding through this first and prettiest part of my night walk, my mind remained passively open to the impressions produced by the view, and I thought but little on any subject. Indeed, so far as my own sensations were concerned, I can hardly say I thought at all. But when I had left the heath and turned into the by-road, where there was less to see, the ideas naturally engendered by the approaching change in my habits and occupations gradually drew more and more of my attention exclusively to themselves. By the time I had arrived at the end of the road, I had become completely absorbed in my own fanciful visions of Limmeridge House, of Mr. Fairlie, and of the two ladies whose practice in the art of water-colour painting I was so soon to superintend. I had now arrived at that particular point on my walk where 4 roads met: the road to Hampstead, along which I had returned, the road to Finchley, the road to West End, and the road back to London. I had mechanically turned in this latter direction, and was strolling along the lonely high road, idly wondering, I remember, what the Cumberland young ladies would look like, when in one moment every drop of blood in my body was brought to a stop by the touch of a hand laid lightly and suddenly on my shoulder from behind me. I turned on the instant, with my fingers tightening round the handle of my stick. There, in the middle of the broad, bright high road. There, as if it had that moment sprung out of the earth or dropped from the heaven, stood the figure of a solitary woman, dressed from head to foot in white garments, her face bent in grave inquiry on mine, her hand pointing to the dark cloud over London as I faced her. I was far too seriously startled by the suddenness with which this extraordinary apparition stood before me in the dead of night and in that lonely place, to ask what she wanted. The strange woman spoke first. "Is that the road to London?" she said. I looked attentively at her as she put that singular question to me. It was nearly 1 o'clock. All I could discern distinctly by the moonlight was a colourless, youthful face, meagre and sharp to look at about the cheeks and chin, large, grave, wistful, attentive eyes, nervous, uncertain lips, and light hair of a pale brownish-yellow hue. There was nothing wild, nothing immodest in her manner. It was quiet and self-controlled, a little melancholy and a little touched by suspicion. Not exactly the manner of a lady, but at the same time not the manner of a woman in the humblest rank of life. The voice, little as I had yet heard of it, had something curiously still and mechanical in its tones, and the utterance was remarkably rapid. She held a small bag in her hand, and her dress, bonnet, shawl, and gown, all of white, was, so far as I could guess, certainly not composed of very delicate or very expensive materials. Her figure was slight, and rather above the average height. Her gait and actions free from the slightest approach to extravagance. This was all I could observe of her in the dim light and under the perplexingly strange circumstances of our meeting. What sort of a woman she was, and how she came to be out alone in the high road an hour after midnight, I altogether failed to guess. The one thing of which I felt certain was that the grossest of mankind could not have misconstrued her motive in speaking, even at that suspiciously late hour and in that suspiciously lonely place. "Did you hear me?" she said, still quietly and rapidly, and without the least fretfulness or impatience. I asked if that was the way to London. "Yes," I replied, "that's the way. It leads to St. John's Wood and Regent's Park. You must excuse my not answering you before. I was rather startled by your sudden appearance in the road, and I am, even now, quite unable to account for it." "You don't suspect me of doing anything wrong, do you?" "I have done nothing wrong. I have met with an accident. I am very unfortunate in being here alone so late. Why do you suspect me of doing wrong?" She spoke with unnecessary earnestness and agitation, and shrank back from me several paces. I did my best to reassure her. "Oh, pray don't suppose that I have any idea of suspecting you," I said, "or any other wish than to be of assistance to you, if I can. I only wondered at your appearance in the road, because it seemed to me to be empty the instant before I saw you." She turned and pointed back to a place at the junction of the road to London and the road to Hampstead, where there is a gap in the hedge. "I heard you coming," she said, "and hid there to see what sort of man you were before I risked speaking. I doubted and feared about it till you passed, and then I was obliged to steal after you and touch you." Steal after me and touch me? Why not call to me? Strange, to say the least of it. "May I trust you?" she asked. "You don't think the worse of me because I've met with an accident?" She stopped in confusion, shifted her bag from one hand to the other, and sighed bitterly. The loneliness and helplessness of the woman touched me. The natural impulse to assist her and to spare her got the better of the judgment, the caution, the worldly tact which an older, wiser, and colder man might have summoned to help him in this strange emergency. "You may trust me for any harmless purpose," I said. "If it troubles you to explain your strange situation to me, don't think of returning to the subject again. I've no right to ask you for any explanations. Tell me how I can help you, and if I can, I will." "You're very kind, and I'm very, very thankful to have met you." The first touch of womanly tenderness that I had heard from her trembled in her voice as she said these words. But no tears glistened in those large, wistfully attentive eyes of hers, which were still fixed on me. "I've only been in London once before," she went on, more and more rapidly, "and I know nothing about that side of it yonder. Can I get a fly or a carriage of any kind? Is it too late? I don't know. If you could show me where to get a fly, and if you will only promise not to interfere with me, and to let me leave you when and how I please. I have a friend in London who'll be glad to receive me. I want nothing else. Will you promise?" She looked anxiously up and down the road, shifted her bag again from one hand to the other, and repeated the words, "Will you promise?" with a look hard in my face, with a pleading fear and confusion that it troubled me to see. What could I do? Here was a stranger utterly and helplessly at my mercy, and that stranger a forlorn woman. No house was near. No one was passing whom I could consult. No earthly right existed on my part to give me a power of control over her, even if I had known how to exercise it. I trace these lines self-distrustfully, with the shadows of after-events darkening the very paper I write on. And still I say, what could I do? What I did do was try and gain time by questioning her. "Are you sure that your friend in London will receive you at such a late hour as this?" I said. "Quite sure. Only say you will let me leave you when and how I please. Only say you won't interfere with me. Will you promise?" As she repeated the words for the third time, she came close to me and laid her hand, with a sudden gentle stealthiness, on my bosom. A thin hand, a cold hand when I removed it with mine, even on that sultry night. Remember that I was young. Remember that the hand that touched me was a woman's. "Will you promise?" "Yes." One word. The little familiar word that is on everyone's lips every hour of the day. Oh me! And I tremble now when I write it. We set our faces towards London, and walked on together in the first still hour of the new day. I and this woman, whose name, whose character, whose story, whose objects in life, whose very presence at my side at that moment, were fathomless mysteries to me. It was like a dream. Was I Walter Hartright? Was this the well-known, uneventful road where holiday people strolled on Sundays? Had I really left, little more than an hour since, the quiet, decent, conventionally domestic atmosphere of my mother's cottage? I was too bewildered, too conscious also of a vague sense of something like self-reproach, to speak to my strange companion for some minutes. It was her voice again that first broke the silence between us. "I want to ask you something," she said suddenly. "Do you know many people in London?" "Yes, a great many." "Many men of rank and title?" There was an unmistakable tone of suspicion in the strange question. I hesitated about answering. "Some," I said, after a moment's silence. "Many?" She came to a full stop, then looked at me searchingly in the face. "Many men of the rank of baronet?" Too much astonished to reply, I questioned her in my turn. "Why do you ask?" "Because I hope for my own sake that there is one baronet that you do not know." "Will you tell me his name?" "I can't. I daren't. I forget myself when I mention it." She spoke loudly and almost fiercely, raised her clenched hand in the air and shook it passionately, and then on a sudden controlled herself again, and added in tones lowered to a whisper, "Tell me which of them you know." I could hardly refuse to humour her in such a trifle, and I mentioned 3 names. 2 the names of fathers of families whose daughters I taught. 1 the name of a bachelor who had once taken me in a cruise on his yacht to make sketches for him. "Ah, you don't know him," she said with a sigh of relief. "Are you a man of rank and title yourself?" "Far from it. I'm only a drawing master." As the reply passed my lips, a little bitterly perhaps, she took my arm with the abruptness which characterized all her actions. "Not a man of rank and title," she repeated to herself. "Thank God, I may trust him." I had hitherto contrived to master my curiosity out of consideration for my companion, but it got the better of me now. "I'm afraid you have serious reason to complain of some man of rank and title?" I asked. "I'm afraid the baronet, whose name you are unwilling to mention to me, has done you some grievous wrong. Is he the cause of your being out here at this strange time of night?" "Don't ask me. Don't make me talk of it," she answered. "I'm not fit now. I have been cruelly used and cruelly wronged. You will be kinder than ever if you will walk on fast and not speak to me. I sadly want to quiet myself, if I can." We moved forward again at a quick pace, and for half an hour, at least, not a word passed on either side. From time to time, being forbidden to make any more inquiries, I stole a look at her face. It was always the same, the lips close shut, the brow frowning, the eyes looking straight forward, eagerly yet absently. We had reached the first houses, and were close to the new Wesleyan College, before her set features relaxed, and she spoke once more. "Do you live in London?" she said. "Yes," I answered. It struck me that she might have formed some intention of appealing to me for assistance or advice, and that I ought to spare her a possible disappointment by warning her of my approaching absence from home. So I added, "But tomorrow I shall be away from London for some time. I'm going into the country." "Where?" she asked. "North or south?" "North, to Cumberland." "Cumberland?" She repeated the word tenderly. "Ah, I wish I was going there too. I was once happy in Cumberland." I tried again to lift the veil that hung between this woman and me. "Perhaps you were born," I said, "in that beautiful lake country." "No," she answered. "I was born in Hampshire, but I once went to school for a little while in Cumberland. Lakes? I don't remember any lakes. It's Limmeridge village and Limmeridge House I should like to see again." It was my turn now to stop suddenly. In the excited state of my curiosity at that moment, the chance reference to Mr. Fairlie's place of residence on the lips of my strange companion staggered me with astonishment. "Did you hear anybody calling after us?" she asked, looking up and down the road affrightedly. The instant I stopped. No. I was only struck by the name of Limmeridge House. I heard it mentioned by some Cumberland people a few days since." "Ah, not my people. Mrs. Fairlie is dead, and her husband is dead, and their little girl may be married and gone away by this time. I can't say who lives at Limmeridge now. If any more are left there of that name, I only know I love them for Mrs. Fairlie's sake." She seemed about to say more, but while she was speaking we came within view of the turnpike at the top of the Avenue Road. Her hand tightened round my arm, and she looked anxiously at the gate before us. "Is the turnpike man looking out?" she asked. He was not looking out. No one else was near the place when we passed through the gate. The sight of the gas lamps and houses seemed to agitate her and to make her impatient. "This is London," she said. "Do you see any carriage I can get? I'm tired and frightened. I want to shut myself in and be driven away." I explained to her that we must walk a little further to get to a cab stand, unless we were fortunate enough to meet with an empty vehicle, and then I tried to resume the subject of Cumberland. It was useless. The idea of shutting herself in and being driven away had now got full possession of her mind. She could think and talk of nothing else. We had hardly proceeded a third of the way down Avenue Road when I saw a cab draw up at a house a few doors below us, on the opposite side of the way. A gentleman got out and let himself in at the garden door. I hailed the cab, as the driver mounted the box again. When we crossed the road, my companion's impatience increased to such an extent that she almost forced me to run. "It's so late," she said. "I'm only in a hurry because it's so late." "Can't take you, sir, if you're not going towards Tottenham Court Road," said the driver civilly, when I opened the cab door. "My horse is dead beat. I can't get him to go no further than the stable." Yes, that will do for me. I'm going that way. She spoke with breathless eagerness, and pressed by me into the cab. I had assured myself that the man was sober as well as civil before I let her enter the vehicle, and now, when she was seated inside, I entreated her to let me see her set down safely at her destination. No, she said vehemently. "I'm quite safe, and I'm quite happy now. If you're a gentleman, remember your promise. Let him drive on till I stop him. Thank you. Oh, thank you. My hand was on the cab door. She caught it in hers, kissed it, and pushed it away. The cab drove off at the same moment. I started into the road with some vague idea of stopping it again. I hardly knew why. Hesitated from dread of frightening and distressing her. Called at last, but not so loudly as to attract the driver's attention. The sound of the wheels grew fainter in the distance. The cab melted into the black shadows on the road. The woman in white was gone. 10 minutes or more had passed. I was still on the same side of the way, now mechanically walking forward a few paces, now stopping again absently. At one moment I found myself doubting the reality of my own adventure, At another I was perplexed and distressed by an uneasy sense of having done wrong, which yet left me confusedly ignorant of how I could have done right. I hardly knew where I was going, or what I meant to do next. I was conscious of nothing but the confusion of my own thoughts, when I was abruptly recalled to myself, awakened, I must almost say, by the sound of rapidly approaching wheels close behind me. I was on the dark side of the road, in the thick shadow of some garden trees, when I stopped to look round. On the opposite and lighter side of the way, a short distance below me, a policeman was strolling along in the direction of Regent's Park. A carriage passed me, an open chaise driven by two men. "Stop!" cried one. "There's a policeman. Let's ask him." The horse was instantly pulled up, a few yards beyond the dark place where I stood. "Policeman," cried the first speaker, "have you seen a woman pass this way?" "What sort of woman, sir?" "A woman in a lavender-coloured gown." "No, no," interposed the second man. "The clothes we gave her were found on her bed. She must have gone away in the clothes she wore when she came to us. In white, policeman. A woman in white." "I haven't seen her, sir." "If you or any of your men meet with the woman, stop her, and send her in careful keeping to that address. I'll pay all expenses, and a fair reward into the bargain." The policeman looked at the card that was handed down to him. "Why are we to stop her, sir? What's she done?" "Done? She's escaped from my asylum. Don't forget, a woman in white. Drive on."
End of Track 1. Track 2. The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Track 2.
The First Epoch. 5. She has escaped from my asylum. I cannot say with truth that the terrible inference which those words suggested flashed upon me like a new revelation. Some of the strange questions put to me by the woman in white, after my ill-considered promise to leave her free to act as she pleased, had suggested the conclusion either that she was naturally flighty and unsettled, or that some recent shock of terror had disturbed the balance of her faculties. But the idea of absolute insanity, which we all associate with the very name of an asylum, had, I can honestly declare, never occurred to me in connection with her. I had seen nothing in her language or her actions to justify it at the time, and even with the new light thrown on her by the words which the stranger had addressed to the policeman, I could see nothing to justify it now. What had I done? Assisted the victim of the most horrible of all false imprisonments to escape, or cast loose on the wide world of London an unfortunate creature whose actions it was my duty and every man's duty mercifully to control? I turned, sick at heart, when the question occurred to me, and when I felt self-reproachfully that it was asked too late. In the disturbed state of my mind, it was useless to think of going to bed. When I at last got back to my chambers in Clement's Inn, before many hours elapsed, it would be necessary to start on my journey to Cumberland. I sat down and tried, first to sketch, then to read. But the woman in white got between me and my pencil, between me and my book. Had the forlorn creature come to any harm? That was my first thought, though I shrank selfishly from confronting it. Other thoughts followed, on which it was less harrowing to dwell. Where had she stopped the cab? What had become of her now? Had she been traced and captured by the men in the chaise? Or was she still capable of controlling her own actions, and were we two following our widely parted roads towards one point in the mysterious future, at which we were to meet once more? It was a relief, when the hour came to lock my door, to bid farewell to London pursuits, London pupils, and London friends, and to be in movement again, towards new interests and a new life. Even the bustle and confusion at the railway terminus, so wearisome and bewildering at other times, roused me and did me good. My travelling instructions directed me to go to Carlisle, and then to diverge by a branch railway which ran in the direction of the coast. As a misfortune to begin with, our engine broke down between Lancaster and Carlisle. The delay occasioned by this accident caused me to be too late for the branch train, by which I was to have gone on immediately. I had to wait some hours, and when a later train finally deposited me at the nearest station to Limmeridge House, it was past 10, and the night was so dark that I could hardly see my way to the pony chaise which Mr. Fairlie had ordered to be waiting for me. The driver was evidently discomposed by the lateness of my arrival. He was in that state of highly respectful sulkiness which is peculiar to English servants. We drove away slowly through the darkness in perfect silence. The roads were bad, and the dense obscurity of the night increased the difficulty of getting over the ground quickly. It was, by my watch, nearly an hour and a half from the time of our leaving the station before I heard the sound of the sea in the distance and the crunch of our wheels on a smooth gravel drive. We had passed one gate before entering the drive, and we passed another before we drew up at the house. I was received by a solemn manservant out of livery, was informed that the family had retired for the night, and was then led to a large and lofty room where my supper was awaiting me, in a forlorn manner, at one extremity of a lonesome mahogany wilderness of a dining-table. I was too tired and out of spirits to eat or drink much, especially with the solemn servant waiting on me as elaborately as if a small dinner-party had arrived at the house instead of a solitary man. In a quarter of an hour I was ready to be taken up to my bedchamber. The solemn servant conducted me into a prettily furnished room and said, "Breakfast at 9 o'clock, sir," looked all around him to see that everything was in its proper place, and noiselessly withdrew. What should I see in my dreams to-night? I thought to myself as I put out the candle. The woman in white, or the unknown inhabitants of this Cumberland mansion? It was a strange sensation to be sleeping in the house like a friend of the family, and yet not to know one of the inmates, even by sight. 6. When I arose the next morning and drew my blind, the sea opened before me joyously under the broad August sunlight, and the distant coast of Scotland fringed the horizon with its lines of melting blue. The view was such a surprise and such a change to me after my weary London experience of brick and mortar landscape, that I seemed to burst into a new life and a new set of thoughts the moment I looked at it. A confused sensation of having suddenly lost my familiarity with the past, without acquiring any additional clearness of idea in reference to the present or to the future, took possession of my mind. Circumstances that were but a few days old faded back in my memory as if they had happened months and months since. Pesca's quaint announcement of the means by which he had produced me my present employment, the farewell evening I had passed with my mother and sister, even my mysterious adventure on the way home from Hampstead, all had become like events which might have occurred in some former epoch of my existence. Although the woman in white was still in my mind, the image of her seemed to have grown dull and faint already. A little before 9 o'clock I descended to the ground floor of the house. The solemn manservant of the night before met me wandering along the passages, and compassionately showed me the way to the breakfast-room. My first glance around me, as the man opened the door, disclosed a well-furnished breakfast-table standing in the middle of a long room with many windows in it. I looked from the table to the window furthest from me, and saw a lady standing at it, with her back turned toward me. The instant my eyes rested on her, I was struck by the rare beauty of her form, and by the unaffected grace of her attitude. Her figure was tall, yet not too tall, comely and well developed, yet not fat. Her head set on her shoulders with an easy, pliant firmness. Her waist, perfection in the eyes of a man, for it occupied its natural place. It filled out its natural circle. It was visible and delightfully undeformed by stays. She had not heard my entrance into the room, and I allowed myself the luxury of admiring her for a few moments before I moved one of the chairs near me, as the least embarrassing means of attracting her attention. She turned towards me immediately. The easy elegance of every movement of her limbs and body, as soon as she began to advance from the far end of the room, set me in a flutter of expectation to see her face clearly. She left the window, and I said to myself, The lady is dark. She moved forward a few steps, and I said to myself, the lady is young. She approached nearer, and I said to myself, with a sense of surprise which words fail me to express, the lady is ugly. Never was the old conventional maxim that nature cannot err more flatly contradicted. Never was the fair promise of a lovely figure more strangely and startlingly belied by the face and head that crowned it. The lady's complexion was almost swarthy, and dark down on her upper lip was almost a moustache. She had a large, firm, masculine mouth and jaw, prominent, piercing, resolute brown eyes, and thick, coal-black hair growing unusually low down on her forehead. Her expression, bright, frank, and intelligent, appealed, while she was silent, to be altogether wanting in those feminine attractions of gentleness and pliability, without which the beauty of the handsomest woman alive is beauty incomplete. To see such a face as this, set on shoulders that a sculptor would have longed to model, to be charmed by the modest graces of action through which the symmetrical limbs betrayed their beauty when they moved, and then to be almost repelled by the masculine form and masculine look of the features in which the perfectly shaped figure ended, was to feel a sensation oddly akin to the helpless discomfort familiar to us all in sleep, when we recognize yet cannot reconcile the anomalies and contradictions of a dream. "Mr. Hartright," said the lady, interrogatively, her dark face lighting up with a smile, and softening and growing womanly the moment she began to speak. "We resigned all hope of you last night, and went to bed as usual. Accept my apologies for our apparent want of attention, and allow me to introduce myself as one of your pupils. Shall we shake hands? I suppose we must come to it sooner or later, and why not sooner?" These odd words of welcome were spoken in a clear, ringing, pleasant voice. The offered hand, rather large but beautifully formed, was given to me with the easy, unaffected self-reliance of a highly bred woman. We sat down together at the breakfast table in as cordial and customary a manner as if we had known each other for years, and had met at Limmeridge House to talk over old times by previous appointment. "I hope you come here good-humouredly determined to make the best of your position," continued the lady. "You will have to begin this morning by putting up with no other company at breakfast than mine. My sister is in her own room, nursing that essentially feminine malady, a slight headache, and her old governess, Mrs. Vasey, is charitably attending on her with restorative tea. My uncle, Mr. Fairlie, never joins us at any of our meals. He is an invalid, and keeps bachelor state in his own apartments. There's no one else in the house but me. 2 young ladies have been staying here, but they went away yesterday in despair, and no wonder. All through their visit, in consequence of Mr. Fairlie's invalid condition, we produced no such convenience in the house as a flirtable, danceable, small-talkable creature of the male sex, and the consequence was, we did nothing but quarrel, especially at dinner-time. How can you expect 4 women to dine together alone every day and not quarrel? We are such fools. We can't entertain each other at table. You see, I don't think much of my own sex, Mr. Hartright. Which will you have, tea or coffee? No woman does think much of her own sex, though few of them confess it as freely as I do. Dear me, you look puzzled. Why, are you wondering what you will have for breakfast, or are you surprised at my careless way of talking? In the first case, I advise you as a friend to have nothing to do with that cold ham at your elbow, and to wait until the omelette comes in. In the second case, I will give you some tea to compose your spirits, and do all a woman can, which is very little, by the by, to hold my tongue." She handed me my cup of tea, laughing gaily. Her light flow of talk and her lively familiarity of manner with a total stranger were accompanied by an unaffected naturalness and an easy inborn confidence in herself and her position, which would have secured her the respect of the most audacious man breathing. While it was impossible to be formal and reserved in her company, it was more than impossible to take the faintest vestige of a liberty with her, even in thought. I felt this instinctively, even while I caught the infection of her own bright gaiety of spirits, even while I did my best to answer her in her own frank, lively way. "Yes, yes," she said, when I had suggested the only explanation I could offer to account for my perplexed looks. "I understand you're such a perfect stranger in the house, that you're puzzled by my familiar references to the worthy inhabitants. Natural enough. I ought to have thought of it before. At any rate, I can set it right now. Suppose I begin with myself, so as to get done with that part of the subject as soon as possible. My name is Marian Halcombe, and I am as inaccurate as women usually are in calling Mr. Fairlie my uncle and Miss Fairlie my sister. My mother was twice married. The first time to Mr. Halcombe, my father, the second time to Mr. Fairlie, my half-sister's father. Except that we're both orphans, we are in every respect as unlike each other as possible. My father was a poor man, and Miss Fairlie's father was a rich man. I have got nothing, and she has a fortune. I am dark and ugly, and she is fair and pretty. Everybody thinks me crabbed and odd, with perfect justice, and everybody thinks her sweet-tempered and charming, with more justice still. In short, she is an angel, and I am... Try some of that marmalade, Mr. Hartright, and finish the sentence. In the name of female propriety, for yourself. What am I to tell you about Mr. Fairlie? Upon my honour, I hardly know. He is sure to send for you after breakfast, and you can study him for yourself. In the meantime, may I inform you, first, that he is the late Mr. Fairlie's younger brother; secondly, that he is a single man; and thirdly, that he is Miss Fairlie's guardian. I won't live without her, and she can't live without me, and that is how I come to be at Limmeridge House. My sister and I are honestly fond of each other, which, you will say, is perfectly unaccountable under the circumstances, and I quite agree with you, but so it is. You must please both of us, Mr. Hartright, or please neither of us. And what is still more trying, you will be thrown entirely upon our society. Mrs. Vesey is an excellent person, who possesses all the cardinal virtues, and counts for nothing. Mr. Fairlie is too great an invalid to be a companion for anybody. I don't know what is the matter with him, and the doctors don't know what is the matter with him, and he doesn't know himself what is the matter with him. We all say it's on the nerves, and we none of us know what we mean when we say it. However, I advise you to humour his little peculiarities when you see him to-day. Admire his collection of coins, prints, and water-colour drawings, and you will win his heart. Upon my word, if you can be contented with a quiet country life, I don't see why you should not get on very well here. From breakfast to lunch, Mr. Fairlie's drawings will occupy you. After lunch, Miss Fairlie and I shoulder our sketch-books and go out to misrepresent nature under your directions. Drawing is her favourite whim, mind, not mine. Women can't draw. Their minds are too flighty. Their eyes are too inattentive. No matter, my sister likes it, and so I waste paint and spoil paper for her sake, as composedly as any woman in England. As for the evenings, I think we can help you through them. Miss Fairlie plays delightfully. For my own poor part, I don't know one note of music from the other, but I can match you at chess, backgammon, escarte, and with the inevitable female drawbacks, even at billiards as well. What do you think of the programme? Can you reconcile yourself to our quiet, regular life? Or do you mean to be restless and secretly thirst for change and adventure in the humdrum atmosphere of Limmeridge House? She had run on thus far in her graceful, bantering way, with no other interruptions on my part than the unimportant replies which politeness required of me. The turn of the expression, however, in her last question, or rather the one chance word adventure, lightly as it fell from her lips, recalled my thoughts to my meeting with the woman in white, and urged me to discover the connection which the stranger's own reference to Mrs. Fairlie informed me must once have existed between the nameless fugitive from the asylum and the former mistress of Limmeridge House. Even if I were the most restless of mankind, I said, I should be in no danger of thirsting after adventures for some time to come. The very night before I arrived at this house, I met with an adventure, and the wonder and excitement of it, I can assure you, Miss Halcombe, will last me for the whole term of my stay in Cumberland, if not for a much longer period. You don't say so, Mr. Hartright. May I hear it? You have a claim to hear it. The chief person in the adventure was a total stranger to me, but may perhaps be a total stranger to you. But she certainly mentioned the name of the late Mrs. Fairlie, in terms of the sincerest gratitude and regard. Mentioned my mother's name? You interest me indescribably. Pray go on. I at once related the circumstances under which I had met the woman in white, exactly as they had occurred, and I repeated what she had said to me about Mrs. Fairlie and Limmeridge House, word for word. Miss Halcombe's bright, resolute eyes looked eagerly into mine, from the beginning of the narrative to the end. Her face expressed vivid interest and astonishment, but nothing more. She was evidently as far from knowing any clue to the mystery as I was myself. "Are you quite sure of those words referring to my mother?" she asked. "Quite sure," I replied. "Whoever she may be, the woman was once at school in the village of Limmeridge, was treated with especial kindness by Mrs. Fairlie, and in grateful remembrance of that kindness feels an affectionate interest in all surviving members of the family. She knew that Mrs. Fairlie and her husband were both dead, and spoke of Miss Fairlie as if they had known each other when they were children." "You said, I think, that she denied belonging to this place?" "Yes, she told me she came from Hampshire." "And you entirely failed to find out her name?" "Entirely." "Very strange. I think you quite justified Mr. Hartright in giving the poor creature her liberty, for she seems to have done nothing in your presence to show herself unfit to enjoy it. But I wish you'd been a little more resolute in finding out her name. We must really clear up this mystery in some way. You'd better not speak of it yet to Mr. Fairlie or to my sister. They are both of them, I'm certain, quite as ignorant of who the woman is, or of what her past history in connection with us can be, as I am myself. But they are also, in widely different ways, rather nervous and sensitive, and you'd only fidget one and alarm the other to no purpose. As for myself, I am all aflame with curiosity, and I devote my whole energies to the business of discovery from this moment. When my mother came here after her second marriage, she certainly established the village school just as it exists at the present time. But the old teachers are all dead or gone elsewhere, and no enlightenment is to be hoped for from that quarter. The only other alternative I can think of—" At this point we were interrupted by the entrance of a servant, with a message from Mr. Fairlie, intimating that he would be glad to see me as soon as I had done breakfast. "Wait in the hall," said Miss Holcombe, answering the servant for me in her quick, ready way. "Mr. Hartright will come out directly. I was about to say," she went on, addressing me again, "that my sister and I have a large collection of my mother's letters, addressed to my father and to hers. In the absence of any other means of getting information, I'll pass the morning in looking over my mother's correspondence with Mr. Fairlie. He was fond of London and was constantly away from his country home, and she was accustomed at such times to write and report to him how things went on at Limmeridge. Her letters are full of references to the school in which she took so strong an interest, and I think it more than likely that I may have discovered something when we meet again. The luncheon hour is 2, Mr. Hartright. I shall have the pleasure of introducing you to my sister at that time, and we will occupy the afternoon in driving round the neighbourhood and showing you all our pet points of view. Till 2 o'clock, then. Farewell." She nodded to me with the lively grace, the delightful refinement of familiarity which characterized all that she did and all that she said, and disappeared by a door at the lower end of the room. As soon as she had left me, I turned my steps towards the hall, followed the servant, on my way for the first time to the presence of Mr. Fairlie. 7. My conductor led me upstairs into a passage which took us back to the bedchamber in which I had slept during the past night, and opening the door next to it, begged me to look in. "I have my master's orders to show you your own sitting-room, sir," said the man, "and to inquire if you approve of the situation and the light." I must have been hard to please indeed if I had not approved of the room, and of everything about it. The bow window looked out on the same lovely view which I had admired in the morning from my bedroom. The furniture was the perfection of luxury and beauty. The table in the centre was bright with gaily bound books, elegant conveniences for writing, and beautiful flowers. The second table near the window was covered with all the necessary materials for mounting water-colour drawings, and had a little easel attached to it, which I could expand or fold up at will. The walls were hung with gaily tinted chintz, and the floor was spread with Indian matting in maize colour and red. It was the prettiest and most luxurious little sitting-room I had ever seen, and I admired it with the warmest enthusiasm. The servant was far too highly trained to betray the slightest satisfaction. He bowed with icy deference when my terms of eulogy were all exhausted, and silently opened the door for me to go out into the passage again. We turned a corner and entered the long second passage, ascended a short flight of stairs at the end, crossed a small circular upper hall, and stopped in front of a door covered with dark baize. The servant opened this door and led me a few yards to a second, opened that also, and disclosed two curtains of pale sea-green silk hanging before us, raised one of them noiselessly, softly uttered the words, "Mr. Hartright," and left me. I found myself in a large, lofty room with a magnificent carved ceiling, and with carpet all over the floor, so thick and soft that it felt like piles of velvet under my feet. One side of the room was occupied by a long bookcase of some rare inlaid wood that was quite new to me. It was not more than 6 feet high, and the top was adorned with statuettes in marble, ranged at regular distances one from the other. On the opposite side stood two antique cabinets, and between them and above them hung a picture of the Virgin and Child, protected by glass and bearing Raphael's name on the gilt tablet at the bottom of the frame. On my right hand and on my left, as I stood inside the door, were chiffonières and little stands in buhl and marqueterie, loaded with figures in Dresden china, with rare vases, ivory ornaments, and toys and curiosities that sparkled at all points with gold, silver, and precious stones. At the lower end of the room opposite to me, the windows were concealed, and the sunlight was tempered by large blinds of the same pale sea-green colour as the curtains over the door. The light thus produced was deliciously soft, mysterious, and subdued. It fell equally upon all the objects in the room, and it helped to intensify the deep silence and the air of profound seclusion that possessed the place. And it surrounded with an appropriate halo of repose the solitary figure of the master of the house, leaning back, listlessly composed, in a large easy chair with a reading easel fastened on one of its arms, and a little table on the other. If a man's personal appearance, when he is out of his dressing-room, and when he has passed 40, can be accepted as a safe guide to his time of life, which is more than doubtful, Mr. Fairlie's age when I saw him might have reasonably been computed as over 50 and under 60 years. His beardless face was thin, worn, and transparently pale, but not wrinkled. His nose was high and hooked. His eyes were of a dim greyish blue, large, prominent, and rather red around the rims of the eyelids. His hair was scanty, soft to look at, and of that light sandy colour which is the last to disclose its own changes towards grey. He was dressed in a dark frock-coat of some substance much thinner than cloth, and in waistcoat and trousers of spotless white. His feet were effeminately small, and were clad in buff-coloured silk stockings, and little womanish bronze leather slippers. 2 rings adorned his white, delicate hands, the value of which even my inexperienced observation detected to be all but priceless. Upon the whole, he had a frail, languidly fretful, over-refined look, something singularly and unpleasantly delicate in its association with a man, and at the same time something which could by no possibility have looked natural and appropriate if it had been transferred to the personal appearance of a woman. My morning's experience with Miss Halcombe had predisposed me to be pleased with everybody in the house, but my sympathies shut themselves up resolutely at the first sight of Mr. Fairlie. On approaching nearer to him, I discovered that he was not so entirely without occupation as I had first supposed. Placed amid the other rare and beautiful objects on a large round table near him was a dwarf cabinet in ebony and silver, containing coins of all shapes and sizes, set out in little drawers lined with dark purple velvet. One of these drawers lay on the small table attached to his chair, and near it were some tiny jeweller's brushes, a wash-leather stump, and a little bottle of liquid, all waiting to be used in various ways for the removal of any accidental impurities which might be discovered on the coins. His frail white fingers were listlessly toying with something which looked, to my uninstructed eyes, like a dirty pewter medal with ragged edges, when I advanced within a respectful distance of his chair and stopped to make my bow. "So glad to possess you at Limmeridge, Mr. Hartright," he said in a querulous, croaking voice, which combined in anything but an agreeable manner a discordantly high tone with a drowsily languid utterance. "Pray sit down, and don't trouble yourself to move the chair, please. In the wretched state of my nerves, movement of any kind is exquisitely painful to me. Have you seen your studio? Will it do?" "I've just come from seeing the room, Mr. Fairlie, and I assure you—" He stopped me in the middle of my sentence by closing his eyes and holding up one of his white hands imploringly. I paused in astonishment, and the croaking voice honoured me with this explanation: "Pray excuse me, and could you contrive to speak in a lower key? In the wretched state of my nerves, loud sound of any kind is indescribable torture to me. You will pardon an invalid. I only say to you that the lamentable state of my health obliges me to say to everybody. Yes. And you really like the room?" "I could wish for nothing prettier and nothing more comfortable," I answered, dropping my voice, and beginning to discover already that Mr. Fairlie's selfish of affectation and Mr. Fairlie's wretched nerves meant one and the same thing. "So glad. You will find your position here, Mr. Hartright, properly recognized. There is none of the horrid English barbarity of feeling about the social position of an artist in this house. So much of my early life has been passed abroad that I have quite cast my insular skin in that respect. I wish I could say the same of the gentry, detestable word, but I suppose I must use it, of the gentry in the neighbourhood. They are sad Goths in art, Mr. Hartright, people, I do assure you, who would have opened their eyes in astonishment if they had seen Charles V. pick up Titian's brush for him. Do you mind putting this tray of coins back in the cabinet and giving me the next one to it? In the wretched state of my nerves, exertion of any kind is unspeakably disagreeable to me. Yes, thank you." As a practical commentary on the liberal social theory which he had just favoured me by illustrating, Mr. Fairlie's cool request rather amused me. I put back one drawer and gave him the other, with all possible politeness. He began trifling with the new set of coins and the little brushes immediately, languidly looking at them and admiring them all the time he was speaking to me. "A thousand thanks and a thousand excuses. Do you like coins?" "Yes. So glad we have another taste in common besides our taste for art. Now, about the pecuniary arrangements between us. Do tell me, are they satisfactory?" "Most satisfactory, Mr. Fairlie." "So glad. And what next? Ah, I remember. Yes. In reference to the consideration which you are good enough to accept for giving me the benefit of your accomplishment in art, my steward will wait on you at the end of the first week to ascertain your wishes. And what next? Curious, is it not? I had a great deal more to say, and I appear to have quite forgotten it. Do you mind touching the bell in that corner? Yes. Thank you." I rang, and a new servant noiselessly made his appearance, a foreigner, with a set smile and perfectly brushed hair, a valet every inch of him. "Louis," said Mr. Fairlie, dreamily dusting the tips of his fingers with one of the tiny brushes for the coins, "I made some entries in my tablette this morning. Find my tablette? 1,000 pardons, Mr. Hartright, I'm afraid to bore you." As he wearily closed his eyes again before I could answer, and as he did most assuredly bore me, I sat silent and looked up at the Madonna and Child by Raphael. In the meantime, the valet left the room and returned shortly with a little ivory book. Mr. Fairlie, after first relieving himself by a gentle sigh, let the book drop open with one hand, and held up the tiny brush with the other, as a sign to the servant to wait for further orders. "Yes, just so," said Mr. Fairlie, consulting the tablette. "Louis, take down that portfolio." He pointed as he spoke to several portfolios placed near the window on mahogany stands. No, not the one with the green back. That contains my Rembrandt etchings, Mr. Hartright. Do you like etchings?" "Yes." "So glad we have another taste in common. The portfolio with the red back, Louis. Don't drop it. You have no idea of the tortures I should suffer, Mr. Hartright, if Louis dropped that portfolio. Is it safe on the chair? Do you think it safe, Mr. Hartright? Yes? So glad. Will you oblige me by looking at the drawings, if you really think they're quite safe? Louis, go away. What an ass you are. Don't you see me holding the tablette? Do you suppose I want to hold them? Then why not relieve me of the tablette without being told? A thousand pardons, Mr. Hartright. Servants are such asses, are they not? Do tell me, what do you think of the drawings? They have come from a sale in a shocking state. I thought they smelt of horrid dealers' and brokers' fingers when I opened them last. Can you undertake them? Although my nerves were not delicate enough to detect the odour of plebeian fingers which had offended Mr. Fairlie's nostrils, my taste was sufficiently educated to enable me to appreciate the value of the drawings while I turned them over. They were, for the most part, really fine specimens of English water-colour art, and they had deserved much better treatment at the hands of their former possessor than they appeared to have received. The drawings, I answered, require careful straining and mounting, and in my opinion they are well worth— I beg your pardon, interposed Mr. Fairlie. Do you mind my closing my eyes while you speak? Even this light is too much for them. Yes? I was about to say that the drawings are well worth all the time and trouble. Mr. Fairlie suddenly opened his eyes again, rolled them with an expression of helpless alarm in the direction of the window. I entreat you to excuse me, Mr. Hartright, he said in a feeble flutter, but surely I heard some horrid children in the garden. My private garden below? I can't say, Mr. Fairlie. I heard nothing myself. Oblige me. You have been so very good in honouring my poor nerves. Oblige me by lifting the corner of the blind. Don't let the sun in on me, Mr. Hartright. Have you got the blind up? Yes. Then will you be so very kind as to look into the garden and make quite sure? I complied with this new request. The garden was carefully walled in all around. Not a human creature, large or small, appeared in any part of the sacred seclusion. I reported that gratifying fact to Mr. Fairlie. A thousand thanks. My fancy, I suppose. There are no children, thank heaven, in the house, but the servants, persons born without nerves, will encourage the children from the village. Such brats! Oh, dear me, such brats! Shall I confess it, Mr. Hartright? I sadly want a reform in the construction of children. Nature's only idea seems to be to make them machines for the production of incessant noise. Surely our delightful Raffaello's conception is infinitely preferable. He pointed to the picture of the Madonna, the upper part of which represented the conventional cherubs of Italian art, celestially provided with sitting accommodation for their chins on balloons of buff-coloured cloud. Quite a model family, said Mr. Fairlie, leering at the cherubs. Such nice round faces, such nice soft wings, and nothing else. No dirty little legs to run about on, no noisy little lungs to scream with. How immeasurably superior to the existing construction. I will close my eyes again, if you will allow me. And you really can manage the drawings? So glad. Is there anything else to settle? If there is, I think I have forgotten it. Shall we ring for Louis again? Being by this time quite as anxious on my side as Mr. Fairlie evidently was on his to bring the interview to a speedy conclusion, I thought that I would try to render the summoning of the servant unnecessary by offering the requisite suggestion of my own responsibility. The only point, Mr. Fairlie, that remains to be discussed, I said, refers, I think, to the instruction in sketching which I am engaged to communicate to the two young ladies. Ah, just so. I wish I had felt strong enough to go into that part of the arrangement, but I don't. The ladies who profit by your kind services, Mr. Hartright, must settle and decide and so on for themselves. My niece is fond of your charming art. She knows just enough about it to be conscious of her own sad defects. Please take pains with her. Yes? Is there anything else? No? We quite understand each other, don't we? I have no right to detain you any longer from your delightful pursuit, have I? So pleasant to have settled everything. Just a sensible relief to have done business. Do you mind ringing for Louis to carry the portfolio to your own room? I'll carry it there myself, Mr. Fairlie, if you'll allow me. Will you really? Are you strong enough? How nice to be so strong. Are you sure you won't drop it? So glad to possess you at Limmeridge, Mr. Hartright. I'm such a sufferer that I hardly dare hope to enjoy much of your society. Would you mind taking great pains not to let the doors bang? And do not drop the portfolio. Thank you. Gently with the curtains, please. The slightest noise from them goes through me like a knife. Yes. Good morning. When the sea-green curtains were closed, and when the two baize doors were shut behind me, I stopped for a moment in the little circular hall beyond, and drew a long, luxurious breath of relief. It was like coming to the surface of the water after deep diving, to find myself once more on the outside of Mr. Fairlie's room. As soon as I was comfortably established for the morning in my pretty little studio, the first resolution at which I arrived was to turn my steps no more in the direction of the apartments occupied by the master of the house, except in the very improbable event of his honouring me with a special invitation to pay him another visit. Having settled this satisfactory plan of future conduct in reference to Mr. Fairlie, I soon recovered the serenity of temper of which my employer's haughty familiarity and impudent politeness had for the moment deprived me. The remaining hours of the morning passed away pleasantly enough, in looking over the drawings, arranging them in sets, trimming their ragged edges, and accomplishing the other necessary preparations in anticipation of the business of mounting them. I ought, perhaps, to have made more progress than this, but as the luncheon time drew near, I grew restless and unsettled, and felt unable to fix my attention on work, even though that work was only of the humble manual kind. At 2 o'clock I descended again to the breakfast-room, a little anxiously. Expectations of some interest were connected with my approaching reappearance in that part of the house. My introduction to Miss Fairlie was now close at hand, and if Miss Halcombe's search through her mother's letters had produced the result which she anticipated, the time had come for clearing up the mystery of the woman in white.
End of Track 2.